pleasure of hearing from Jen Rooney, who's the founder at the Wellbeing Tortoise. Jen is going to cover off a number of things, and not least supporting disabled staff to work from home. As we've heard from the speakers so far, COVID-19 provides an opportunity for us to rethink what we mean when we're talking about agile working or remote working. So I'm really excited to welcome Jen. Jen, if you could come off mute, and if you wish to, we can see you.
Hello.
Hello. So we're
Brilliant.
a teeny bit late, so if I can shave maybe 1 minute off your slot.
Yeah, I think I can do it.
Lovely. Welcome.
Brilliant. Thank you, Kate.
Over to you.
Lovely. So as I'm shaving my time, I'll just give a very brief introduction to myself. So I'm really passionate about the topic today because I've worked both as a disability inclusion consultant, and I'm also disabled myself. So I've essentially worked to help people and managers and HR teams implement reasonable adjustments, but I also use reasonable adjustments in my own life. So it's a topic that I'm really fond of, and I'm really happy to be sharing it with you today. So I'm just going to pop my screen on. And if Kate or Kieran, if you can let me know if you can see that.
Yes, that's perfect.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, fab. So today I'm going to be talking about supporting disabled staff to work from home. And as I said, this is a really exciting topic for me to be talking about. I had a brain injury after a ski accident about 4.5 years ago, and it basically just shifted my entire life. And I've had to learn to kind of use adaptive technology, navigate life as a disabled person. And one of the things that kind of keeps me going is the ability to use reasonable adjustments and adaptive technology and remote working to enable myself to thrive at work. So I'll just, for those that aren't viewing the screen, there's a picture of the logo of the Wellbeing Tortoise. And basically I created the Wellbeing Tortoise because my motto through my own recovery was go slow to go fast, because I would try things too quickly and then I would fall back and be in bed for days or weeks or in pain. And so I started telling myself, go slow to go fast, and take little steps and be proud of those little steps. And I think that really applies today. I think disability inclusion and managing disability at work can feel so large. And if we just take small steps, one step at a time, we can really make a massive difference. So I'm all about awareness and action. So hopefully I'll be throwing a lot of practical tips at you today. So basically we're going to be looking at, firstly, understanding a duty of care. Secondly, providing management and support from afar. And thirdly, looking at simple and effective adjustments in the workplace. So the 1974 Health and Safety Act at Work makes no distinction between home-based and office-based workers. So essentially the duty of care is the same, but it could be argued that it's even more important because employers and managers and teams have less visibility over the work environment. So there's kind of 3 key areas I just wanted to briefly mention. We're still, as employers, we're still responsible to conduct a risk assessment to make sure people are working in safe conditions. Obviously, in a pandemic, it doesn't make much sense to have people come in and do a risk assessment. So legal teams and organizations like ACAS are recommending that employees do those risk assessments themselves with employer guidance. The second one is you're still required to provide any necessary equipment. That's both for disabled and non-disabled people, whether that's an ergonomic chair or adaptive technology. And then the third is you're still required under the Equality Act to consider reasonable adjustments for disabled people. So it's also really important that we make sure we stay in contact with our teams, and in particular our disabled employees, to make sure they have the proper support that they need. Because if we don't ask, we don't know. And Fazila made a great comment about that. Just because you might have worked with someone that's blind doesn't mean you know what I need. So ask me, talk to me about it. So I think that's a really, really key point. So when communicating with disabled staff members, it's really important to kind of follow these kind of key guidelines, I guess. There's 6 of them. So the first one, and I think the most important one, is don't assume. I think we spend a lot of time making assumptions about people in general and about disabled people in particular. And if my experience of becoming disabled later in life has taught me anything, it's that no person's experience of disability is the same as someone else's, even if you have the exact same condition. We are individuals, we have individual experiences, and it can be compounded by other aspects of our life as well. You might be disabled and gay, you might be disabled and Black, and that adds an additional layer of challenge and barriers and stigma. And so it's really important that we're going into conversations leaving assumptions behind and just asking questions. And then once we ask those questions, really listen. I think it's really interesting that in school, at least in Canada anyway, that's where I'm from, we learn how to read, we learn how to write, we learn how to speak, and we don't spend very much time learning how to listen, and yet we spend most of our lives listening. So it's really important that we kind of allow people to speak. We don't input with our own judgments, our own assumptions, and we can ask open questions, but let those people tell us what they need. And then the fourth one is just to have compassion. I think this is really important because we're not always going to understand what people need or why they need it, and that's okay. But we can understand that people have those needs, or people might be struggling, and we can hope to put something in place to support them. So again, when we're communicating, it's important that we offer support and that we follow up. I think it's really key that if we're starting these conversations about disability and reasonable adjustments in the workplace, we're ready to follow up, because I think it can be very frustrating. And as Karen said, it can be really demotivating when you're asking for what you need and people are ignoring you, or they're pretending that they can't do it, or they're just not even engaging in the conversation. So when you have these conversations, make sure you have a follow-up plan in place. And so in order to provide management and support from afar, it's really important that we kind of first understand individual needs, second, implement immediate and any simple reasonable adjustments that we can, and thirdly, acknowledge that more complex adjustments may be needed and support your employees through that process. So as Karen mentioned, there's a lot of fear around disability in general, and the best way to kind of start the conversation is just to ask people what they need. It's not that complicated, although sometimes it can seem more complicated than it is. So there's essentially kind of two groups that I think of when you're talking about opening the conversation about disability in the workplace. So the first one is people that have actually disclosed that they're disabled or they have a health condition or mental health problem. The second one is people that haven't disclosed but might actually have an impairment or be struggling with a health condition or whatever that might be. So for people that haven't disclosed, it's really important to give them that space and make them know that you're open to even just having that conversation. So it doesn't need to be complicated. It can be, depending on your work environment, it can be an email. You can discuss it kind of in a one-to-one chat. But basically, you can even send it out after this event today and say, I learned so much information. I'm really excited to share it with you as an organization. If you have an impairment, health condition, or mental health problem and could benefit from reasonable adjustments or other support, please feel free to schedule a meeting with me or send me an email, or whatever other inclusive forms that work for your organization. And then I think it's also really important to add, kind of, if you're unsure and want to learn more, have a look at ACAS, Remploy, or Disability Rights UK, because people might not know that if they're struggling at work, it's not anything about them, it's just maybe they don't have the right support in place. So for example, for me, I didn't consider myself disabled until about 6 months ago, even though I wasn't able to say it out loud because I didn't feel like I kind of fit what I thought disability was. And so kind of learning about the Equality Act and getting more involved in the disabled community enabled me to figure out, oh, actually, yes, I do have a substantial long-term negative effect on my ability to do normal activities, air quote, normal activities. So it can be helpful to kind of even just provide that definition of disability, because some people might not even know what they're experiencing does amount to that. And then if someone has disclosed, and you haven't, I'd like to think that if they had disclosed, you would have already had a conversation, but and you can do that in kind of an email chain works for that individual person. But basically, I've kind of designed this disability well-being blueprint. I'm not sure if any of you know Mind's wellness action plan about mental health at work. But basically it's a series of questions that enable employers to better understand what their employees need. So these are just a few questions. The list is much more comprehensive. But the first one is, how does your condition or impairment affect you at work and or at home? Are there any aspects of remote working that might negatively affect you or already have? How is remote working impacting your mental health? I think this one is really key. I think often we separate mental health from disability at work, and they're so incredibly interlinked, because you're experiencing discrimination based on your disability in the workplace, or you don't have the adjustments, that's going to weigh on you. That's going to impact your mental health. So I think that's a really important connection that we need to make. And then the fourth is, would any reasonable adjustments help you during this time? So example, flexible working time, adaptive technology, and then just how can I best support you? Just having a very open conversation to try and understand individual needs. As Fazile said, that's kind of the best thing that we can do is have that conversation. And then, as I mentioned, the key is to follow through. So people are really afraid of cost and effort of simple and effective adjustments, adjustments in general. But there are simple and effective and cheap and free, reasonable adjustments that can make a massive difference in people's blessing for many disabled people, but it has also brought a lot of challenges. So for example, people might have lost equipment or support that they used to have in an office-based environment. Perhaps they don't have a quiet workspace, or they don't even have a workspace. People have been working on ironing boards in bedrooms, and that can pose a lot of challenges as well. You might have difficulty with fewer breaks. That's kind of inherent in remote working. Studies show that people work more hours in a remote working space, and breaks can be incredibly important for disabled people in particular. Also, routine change can be incredibly difficult, especially for people in the neurodiverse community. Heightened isolation, a lot of disabled people are already isolated, and then you lose that kind of camaraderie in the workplace, so you might have heightened isolation. A managerial style change could be quite impactful. And then I think a massive one that people have been talking about a lot is inaccessible technology and communication and inaccessible team socials. So we have that heightened isolation, and everyone's so keen to get people into escape rooms and doing pub quizzes, and no one's really thinking, actually, is this accessible for my entire team? So I think that it can be really, really useful just to start asking what is accessible to your team. And if there's one thing that you can do immediately is just start asking the question, does anyone have any accessibility requirements they would like me to be aware of? It's a very simple question. It gives you the answer you need. People can come back and tell you what's accessible to them and what's not. And also it normalizes the conversation. It makes people feel like they can talk about their accessibility requirements and what they need from you. And then you can know if you should be doing your team calls one way or another, or your socials or your training or whatever that might be. So in terms of reasonable adjustments in particular, Karen briefly mentioned kind of they're enshrined in the Equality Act. And so we have kind of a justice of the peace photo holding a balance of the scales. And basically reasonable adjustments must be effective and empowering, operationally possible, and affordable and proportionate. So it's really important that we think about the disabled person's needs, your team's needs, and the organization's needs. That's why the legislation says you must consider reasonable adjustments. There are adjustments that may not be considered reasonable based on a company size, for example, or these elements to make sure that they are reasonable for your organization. So not everything will be reasonable, but lots of things are reasonable and aren't considered. So ACAS actually categorizes reasonable adjustments into 3 categories, which I find really, really helpful. So the first one is an adjustment to the work environment. The second is adjusting the way that you work, the way that the organization works as a whole. And then the third is to add additional support. So adjusting the work environment is not kind of that simple adjustment that I was requested to talk about, but there are some things you can do in terms of adjusting the way that you work. That opens up a lot of areas for us. And then again, additional support as well. So in terms of just some example adjustments, there's thousands of adjustments, so I can't possibly talk about them all here. But for example, tweaking the work environment in a home-based space, you might find someone who has trouble focusing or who is autistic might want noise canceling headphones. Those can be really inexpensive and easy to get. A desk lamp can be really useful for, again, someone who is autistic or has a visual impairment. Instead of kind of overhead lighting, a desk lamp can be much more accessible and inclusive and helpful. Flexible hours and breaks, I think, is an absolute massive one for many, many, many disabled people. If someone struggles in the morning and prefers to work in the afternoon and evening, that would be a great adjustment. If someone kind of has cognitive overload at some point in the day and they can just take a break and rest their brain and then come back later on, that's another great example. I think, again, sticking to the agenda. If you're having team meetings, don't kind of go with the flow, as they say. Stick to the plan and stick to the agenda, because it can be difficult for some disabled people to have routine change, for example, or to have kind of change in a meeting, or to have you schedule a meeting and then change the date 3 different times. That can be incredibly overwhelming and a challenge for some disabled people. Accessible PowerPoint, I think, is a really important one. A lot of people are working on PowerPoint right now in the remote working space, and there's lots of kind of easy fixes that you can do to make things more accessible. So use a large font greater than 18 point. Use a sans serif font. So that's basically something like Arial. Century Gothic is the one that I use. It's easier for people with dyslexia, for example, to read. Don't use a white background if you can avoid it. Use kind of an off-white or pastel color, because the light sensitivity can be a lot for many disabled people. Have trigger warnings if you're going to use audio or video. That can be both for people with sensory overload and for people with mental health problems.
Jen, just a 1-minute call. We've got a couple of comments in.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, I'll brush through them. And then these 2 are my favorite remote working ones. 60-minute meetings, no more. Change to a 15-minute meeting. People in general need breaks, and disabled people even more. So give them that space. And then ask people what video conferencing system is accessible to them. For some people, it might be Zoom. If you have a hearing impairment or you're deaf, it most likely won't be Zoom. Google Hangouts has great subtitles. Microsoft Teams has good ones as well. Blast past mine. You can ask me if you want, connect with me later. Those were just my reasonable adjustments. And then, yes, Karen actually mentioned Access to Work. So it's a cost sharing program that helps you provide aids and equipment and support workers, sign language interpreters. It's fantastic. I use it. I really recommend it. And then lastly, just in terms of supporting disabled staff to work from home, it's not that complicated. Ask people what they need, listen when they tell you, and respond with a proper support plan in place. It doesn't need to be perfect. The key is to try. And if you don't know, ask. ACAS is fantastic. Remploy, ask me, ask some of the speakers from today, and just make an effort, and your employees will be really thankful for it. Thank you.
Wonderful. Jen, that was an amazing gallop through some fantastic content, and lots of interaction. I had some private messages, there's some public messages. It's all great. Again, lovely to see your enthusiasm and your deep knowledge of this subject really comes through. I mean, a couple of offerings, a couple of comments more than anything. So, the workplace adjustment policy and passport, those tools that you were talking about, a couple of inputs there, really excellent tool to use. We have our own version in our organisation that we use with our clients, and it's excellent. For both clients and employers to instigate meaningful conversations. That cadence
absolutely
that you talked about. Again, another comment here from Carla. I've lived with MS for 16 years and have had relatively few adjustments, but these have been very easy to implement, changing working pattern or time, working from home, even pre-pandemic, once a week, just to allow me to focus on the tasks that I need, and an ergonomic mouse. All very doable, all very inexpensive, which have a huge impact on both my performance and the trust and openness. And we've got Microlink speaking later, and I know they've done lots of work around the average cost of a workplace adjustment, which is really quite negligible.
Yes, absolutely.
One question, Jen, that's come through, I don't know if you have a think about this one. So around remote working, you know, loneliness, you know, we know that it has triggered for many people acute aloneness and loneliness.
Absolutely.
You know, any thoughts about how employers should deal with that, and also heating costs? I mean, who's liable around paying for heating costs? Any thoughts on those things?
Yeah, great questions. I think given time, I'll focus on the loneliness aspect. I think heating is more a health and safety HR question, and that's not my background, so I don't want to offer insights into something I'm not aware of. In terms of loneliness, I think there's lots of things you can do. One of the most common sessions that I'm delivering right now to organizations is about kind of loneliness and isolation. And I've spent over the past 4.5 years, weeks and months in isolation myself. And I think it's just about giving people the tools to connect in a way that they wouldn't have before, and find ways to kind of bring yourself joy, because you can still have joy if you're isolated. I think that's something that people think: if you're isolated, you can't find joy, and you'll stay isolated, and you'll kind of lose, you'll start maybe experiencing depression, for example. But having experienced prolonged isolation, literally in a dark room, unable to listen to TV, read a book, anything, there's lots of little things you can do. And like practicing gratitude, for example, or reliving old memories, or going through old photo albums to increase that joy. And a very Canadian thing, I think, is to kind of create as many groups as possible. So if you are feeling isolated in your organization, create a WhatsApp group for your teams and share like what you're grateful for that week. What are some things that have went well? Just share kind of good things that are going on in your life to kind of counteract the negativity and isolation, because we have an inherent negativity bias as humans. So you kind of need to do 5 positive things to outweigh that one negative. But I think making sure you're engaging your team in accessible and inclusive team socials, or whatever that might be. Socials in general might not always be accessible. So just connecting with people one-to-one, finding out what is making them, was kind of contributing to their isolation, and always signpost to Mind, signpost to Anxiety UK, different organizations can be really helpful as well.
Brilliant. Jen, great stuff. Sorry to cut you off short. This is just so much beautiful and rich material. So lots of engagement. We really thank you for your time and your energy, your passion, your know-how. Lots of questions. Can people get hold of the presentation? And I'm sure that's going to be a yes. At least I hope so. So Jen, for the moment, we'll stand you down. Thank you so much. Great.
Yeah, and please feel free to
great. Lovely.
If you have any more questions. Bye.